webinar. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Shafi Musaddiq, the news editor for Alliance Magazine. Thank you for joining us today. I'm excited to delve into today's conversation on supporting philanthropy's response to global crises and change. And thank you to our sponsors today, Algo American. Before we dip into our conversation, I'm just going to run everybody through our usual housekeeping rules as people come into the webinar. Firstly, there are two ways that you can get involved. Firstly, feel free to introduce yourself using the chat function on the bottom right-hand side of your screen. You should be able to see a little speech bubble. You can also use this chat if you're having any issues with your audio or video. Our team are behind the scenes to help you if you need it. You can also put questions to our panelists at any time using the Slido Q&A on the right-hand side of your screen, as well as asking your own. You'll be able to upvote others if you'd like to see that question asked. I'll be keeping an eye out throughout the webinar, and we'll put questions to our panelists during the Q&A at the end. Also, should you wish to do so, on the bottom left-hand side of your screen, you'll see a CC button. And that button is for closed captioning in English and several other languages. We encourage you to use this if needed. So, to our discussion today, to say it's important is an understatement. Philanthropy leaders are navigating a fundamentally altered landscape with a shrinking civic space and foreign aid cuts. Long-held assumptions are being tested, risk is rising, and the need for collective leadership has never been greater. We'll be looking at where we are now, what is being reimagined, and how collective action can unlock new pathways to resilience, influence, and impact in this increasingly uncertain world. Our three panelists today will help us navigate how philanthropy can adapt and change to crisis. Today, we have Nicole Itano. She's a leader within the Trust Accountability and Inclusion Collaborative, where she works at the forefront of efforts to embed trust, accountability, and inclusion into philanthropic practice. Her work focuses on shifting entrenched power dynamics within the sector, supporting funders to move more participatory and community-led approaches, and strengthening the relationships between philanthropy and the communities it serves. We also have Delphine Morales. She's the Chief Executive Officer of Philia, the leading European network representing thousands of foundations, philanthropic organizations, and infrastructure bodies. In her role, she works to strengthen the philanthropic ecosystem across Europe, fostering collaboration, knowledge exchange, and collective action among members. And finally, we have Erica Miller from the States, Head of Climate Philanthropy at Climate Works Foundation. She leads efforts to mobilize philanthropic capital and coordinate global funding strategies to address the climate crises. Working in close partnership with Wings and other global networks, Erica focuses on strengthening collaboration across funders and ensuring resources are directed towards high-impact, scalable climate solutions. Thank you all for joining. I'm going to start with Nicole. And the last year has been tumultuous. We all know what's happened in the last 12 months. We're not just talking about USAID. We've seen many other foreign aid budgets in Europe slash running in parallel with an uptick in military spend, for example. So in this increasingly uncertain world, what are the basic assumptions about philanthropy that are now under question?
Thanks, Shafi, and thank you for the invitation to be here. So I'm here wearing a hat of something called the Funders Roundtable on the Future of Development. And this is a new initiative that was established last year, really to create a platform and a space for philanthropic leaders to debate and come together around some of these issues and think critically about what role philanthropy can play in this changing world, particularly in the development space. This initiative was seeded by Hilton, Packard, and Humanity and United, but we've had about 30, 35 different philanthropies involved at various stages. And it really emerged out of the shock and dismay that accompanied the dismantling of USAID and, as you mentioned, those broader cuts to ODA. But over time, it's been interesting, and the mood has really shifted. And I think that reflects a shift not just in philanthropy, but in the sector as a whole. And it was really on show last week at the Skoll Forum, which some people on this call may have been at. And there is a growing recognition that the dismantling of that system, aid, but also global cooperation more generally, is painful, and the most vulnerable in our societies are most at risk. But also a recognition there's a huge opportunity for reimagining, rebuilding, and rethinking. And I think a lot of the energy has shifted to that space. And I think this is a move from kind of reactive to proactive, not just thinking about how do we respond to what's happening, but how do we think about what we can build, from dependency to agency, and from thinking of ourselves in philanthropy as supporting projects to supporting systems change. So the roundtable has a couple of functions. So first of all, it's just a space for philanthropies and philanthropic leaders to come together to understand that shifting landscape, provide resources for discussion and learning. I think what we're hoping to move towards is to be more of a platform for aligned action, not just around aligned grant making, but also convening power, advocacy, those other tools that we have in our toolbox. And as a touch point for external partners who want to engage philanthropy around these spaces. So we've developed a bit of a framework to kind of shape our conversations, because development's quite an amorphous and broad area. And so we've decided we're calling this the 4 shifts framework, and it sort of recognizes 4 big shifts that we see coming or emerging, or that we would like to see in the world. And so the first one is about institutions and support for international cooperation, the sort of politics. The second is about finance flows, the money. The third is about shifting power from kind of global to local institutions, so that locally led development, but in the broadest sense, the capacity and infrastructure to deliver at a local level, but also at a country and regional level. And the fourth one is about a shift in philanthropic collaboration from a sort of fragmented philanthropic space to a more coordinated philanthropic space. So we've held a few online and in-person meetings over the past 6 months. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the themes that emerged from those conversations. So first of all, there's been a big thing about narrative, and a sense that we really need to win back public trust, both on development, but also on international cooperation, and frankly, also the role of philanthropy in this space. And that, this has been a very elite, technocratic conversation, and we've lost the public, both in donor countries, but also in countries that are supposed to be benefiting from the development infrastructure. And that, we need to think more critically about how we can support rebuilding that trust and new narratives, not just the old narratives, but new narratives that can rebuild that trust. The second thing there's been a lot of energy around, and a lot of emerging philanthropic collaboration, is around new financing models, and sort of a recognition that ODA, or development aid, is a much smaller part of the pie. And there's a lot of interest from foundations in thinking about how do they use their own capital in more catalytic ways, but also how do they support domestic resource mobilization and the effective use of domestic resource mobilization, but also what role philanthropy has in sort of knitting together all of these different types of finance. So, from domestic all the way up to international, public, private, there's a sense of a risk of fragmentation in the kind of financing space that is harder and harder for countries and our partners to navigate. The third one is around the importance of us really investing in local capacity, and what is our role as philanthropy, not just in supporting civil society, which still remains absolutely crucial, but also in supporting local governments, private sector, and other partners, in communities and in countries, and just thinking more broadly about kind of philanthropy's role in that ecosystem. And finally, I think there's just a real recognition and a lot of discussion around what are the partnerships that philanthropy needs in the future. And that, again, we need to move beyond just thinking about civil society partnerships, but also think about our relationships with the multilateral development banks, with governments, with the private sector, and being a sort of flexible partner that can help connect and unite lots of different types of partners because of the role that we play. So, I think one of the things that's been very clear in this conversation is that philanthropy doesn't have all the answers. No one does. This is a period of sort of reimagining. We're seeing lots of green shoots. Some of those will come to fruition, some of those will not. And that our really role as philanthropy is thinking about how do we support our partners through this crucial period of reimagination, where the kind of long-term future of international development and international cooperation more broadly is going to be set. And so I think, I think there is a real sort of recognition that our role needs to be an empowering one, but this is a crucial moment that we need to invest in.
Thank you so much. There's so much to take from that. The reimagining space, the new financing models. We'll be touching on all of those soon. Thank you. Delphine, I want to go to you. When we speak of crises, polycrises, there seems to be parallels between, for example, the erosion of democracy and alongside that, the core structural elements that are being put to the test in philanthropy. The current system clearly lacks resilience and capacity. Would you say that the very kind of foundational elements of philanthropy are at their most fragile right now?
Thanks so much, Shafi, and thank you for the invitation. Maybe let me start by saying that I do agree with Nicole that we're at a point of recognition that there is a breakdown of something we've known and relied upon for the past decades, but that with that there is also an opportunity to reimagine and see how something new is coming out. I think what's really fundamentally different today than what we've experienced in the past is that rather than having one crisis after the other, we're now operating in a context that is crisis. So the foundation on which we rely in itself is being questioned. And it goes to very deep level that affects, the very essence of our social contract around trust, around how we work, around how we operate, how we interact with others. And that's something that I think we're trying to navigate as we go along. And in that context, obviously, philanthropy is asked to rethink its way of working. It is asked to respond faster, to take more risks, to step up where others are stepping down, which in itself is something that we're challenged to do because the resources we have at our disposal are just not, adequate to do so. At the same time, philanthropy itself is under pressure, both externally and I think also internally. In Europe, we've traditionally had a very favorable enabling environment, but we're seeing that influenced by global trends, there are chilling measures emerging that lead to tightening requirements, scrutiny on advocacy role, more and more introduction of foreign agent laws, etc. And so I think this all puts the system and philanthropy itself with that also at an inflection point. And at this inflection point, I think we're agreeing in most of the conversations we're having that fragmented, siloed approaches and short-term responses to long-term challenges actually increasingly undermine our own legitimacy. And so how we fund, how we govern, how we hold ourselves accountable really affects how philanthropy is seen as potentially being a credible and trustworthy partner in trying to reimagine what a new future could look like. Encouragingly, we are seeing in response to this context of crisis and change that many foundations really do show up with valor and with grit in different ways. And I'd also like to mention a couple that we've observed on our end as Philae, bringing together a wide membership of about 250 foundations and 13 national associations or infrastructure organizations that represent about 8,700 foundations. So first, some of the responses that came up most early, in particular to the dismantling of USAID, was that foundations were trying to find solutions to prioritize emergency and financial support, which obviously is much needed, but also led to a reflection that we couldn't, or philanthropy couldn't, help all their grantees potentially weather the storm, and that in itself also led to questions around whether our own practices, including short-termism, may have contributed to fragility in the first place. And then I think secondly, responding to this very challenged. Foundations increasingly have moved to focusing on organizational resilience and capacity, supporting sustainability through flexible long-term funding, investing in internal systems of their grantees, helping build reserves, supporting with contingency planning, and also paying attention to staff well-being. And none of this obviously is new, but it is becoming ever more urgent, if not foundational in itself. At the same time, as Nicole also mentioned, we're seeing renewed attention to ecosystem collaboration. And I recently came across a quote that said, the greatest risk for philanthropy right now is a failure of collaboration. And I do think that there is truth in that. So our experience at Philea is indeed that there is appetite for collaboration, an increasing appetite for collaboration, but that it remains challenged by limited capacity, by competing priorities, and by cultural barriers. Yet, we're also seeing very clearly that when collaboration works, it has very strong benefits. Shared knowledge is the most obvious win, but also developing more equitable ways of working, reducing duplication, having stronger impacts. So we're seeing that well-designed and purposeful collaborations, because that's, I think, really important to make sure we know why we're collaborating, that this can actually lead to systemic change, in particular when the collaboration also involves policy, includes community voices, and focuses on root causes rather than delivery alone. And then as a last area or trend that we're seeing among our members, it is that desire to look beyond the immediate responses, to really collectively reimagine and invest in futures thinking. And I think I'd be of the opinion that philanthropy is one of the very few places that has that privilege, and with it that responsibility to really pause, to reflect, and to imagine alternatives. And pausing doesn't mean that we stop doing things, but that we do it with an intention of looking beyond what is already available today. And I think, that ability to operate across different time horizons, to absorb uncertainties, and to support experimentation where others cannot, is really an opportunity for philanthropy to contribute to really seeing through the cracks and seeing where we can contribute to helping a new system emerge. So maybe very briefly, also kind of referring on the title of the event today, I also wanted to really underline the importance of networks in all of the points that I've mentioned before. I think networks are seen increasingly as really playing a critical role in defending the space, protecting an enabling environment, in providing the connective tissue that allows us to act more coherently, to share risks, to avoid fragmentation, to build and hold spaces for joint analysis, to build and hold spaces for reimagination, and doing that in a way that really puts the purpose of the philanthropic work first. And at Philea, I must say that we're seeing that really in action every day. So maybe I'll leave it to that, and happy to respond to questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Delphine. I really loved your visual of networks as this kind of connective tissue. And it's a really great bridge to move to Erica at Wings, which is a network in and of itself, and the connective tissue in the climate space. And I'm wondering, Erica, after you've heard both Nicole and Delphine, I'm wondering, particularly in climate philanthropy right now, how is that connective tissue holding up in the multiple crises that we're having? And I'm also really interested to hear your thoughts on whether there's a realistic space for foundations, for example, to influence and engage in advocacy spaces, governance spaces, particularly in the current political environment.
Thank you, Shafi, and thank you for inviting Wings to participate in this discussion today. So yeah, I'm the head of climate at Wings. And for those of you who don't know, Wings, as Shafi mentioned, is a global network of networks. So networks are part of our DNA. It's our bread and butter. It's what we do. It's what we live and breathe. And we bring together a membership of over 230 philanthropy support organizations from across the world, which extends our reach to around 100,000 foundations globally. And what this richness of our membership gives us is not just scale, but it's the diversity in thought and ideas across sectors and in experiences. And the organizations in our membership, they span geographies, cultures, giving traditions, and include philanthropic organizations of all kinds: individual giving, family foundations, corporate foundations, community foundations, but also indigenous and community-led philanthropic funds, but also academia, philanthropic advisors, and more. So really, we bring together the entire ecosystem that exists to support and serve philanthropy. And at Wings, our focus is on three primary things. The first is on influencing the field's transformation agenda, which I'll touch a bit more on. The second is on positioning the collective field of philanthropy as a strategic partner for other actors. And the third is really on strengthening the ecosystem infrastructure that helps philanthropy grow and thrive, and that makes local and domestic resource mobilization possible. And so that ecosystem and infrastructure investment piece is where we at Wings think that we have the most durable response to the crisis context that we're currently operating in. That leaning into that ecosystem and infrastructure, needing to invest in it, strengthen it, and enable it in times of crisis, this for us is the network advantage. And I want to share an example of how we do this through our climate work. And so 5 years ago, we started working on creating a movement, which is ecosystem infrastructure, for climate philanthropy, as we recognize that climate change is a sector-wide credibility risk. It's threatening all of the areas that philanthropy looks to focus on. And so Philanthropy for Climate, which is the initiative we now co-host across the world in partnership with Philea, is a global movement that's encouraging all foundations, regardless of size, geography, or mission area, to integrate climate into their work, from governance to grant making. And Philanthropy for Climate at its core has been a collaboration from across the network, from across the field. It was created, the movement, the initiative, the framework was created through a collaborative process of over 40 philanthropic support organizations from around the world back in 2021. And today it's led by and hosted by 12 networks from national, regional, and global spaces that are leading Philanthropy for Climate commitments in their country. And so this initiative has a multi-pillar framework that's really encouraging and enabling foundations to pull on all of the levers they have. And I think this talks a little bit about needing to break down silos, not only between the funding streams, but also in the ways that we work, right? We can do so much more than just commit resources as philanthropy. And so through Philanthropy for Climate, that's one of the main things we try to narrow in on, is how can funders commit resources, but also include climate considerations into their investment decisions, into their day-to-day operations, and into the advocacy and influencing power that they have to benefit and to have an impact on climate change. So over the past 5 years, through this movement, we've been working with the partners, and as I mentioned, through the 12 or 13 national and regional commitments that we have, we've mobilized nearly 1,000 foundations to come into this movement, foundations of all shapes and sizes from over 30 countries. And so this is the network advantage. Bringing in, using this networked approach, we've been able to mobilize all of these foundations from around the world, and that's the multiplier and leverage effect that networks uniquely bring. And this movement is really about collective action. It's not about one individual actor going on a journey. It's really about the collective journey that everyone's taking together with the contextual reality of where their foundation is from and where they work. Underpinning this work is a commitment to transparency and accountability, which is crucial for the kind of credibility crisis that we face right now. And every year we have a progress tracking mechanism where we take a pulse check on what are the nearly 1,000 foundations that are part of this movement doing to live up to this commitment, right? What are they doing under this framework that we have? And I'm very excited because this year, for the first time, we finally have aggregated data from over 453 foundations of this movement. That's over 50% of the current signatory base. And we're soon going to be launching the first ever movement progress report. So definitely keep an eye out for that. And the data shows us that foundations part of this movement, they have significant influence and can have significant power to make change. They represent well over 5 billion USD in annual expenditures and over 32 billion in endowed assets. And we're also seeing some other interesting things, and I'll give you a sneak peek right now. But the results are showing us that 98% of responding signatories are making progress, but that progress is uneven. And we see that progress follows different pathways depending on the structural realities of the foundations, depending on their size, their governance models, their assets, their capacity, and their context. Encouragingly, 88% have told us that the commitment itself, that Philanthropy for Climate is a framework, is enabling them to progress on this journey. We're also seeing that on the challenges side, the alignment of endowments remains one of the most structurally constrained pillars for foundations, with only about 16% that are reporting being at an advanced stage. And so the data from this report, while it's encouraging that many are acting, it does still highlight many challenges that require attention. And this is what reinforces for us the importance of flexible, context-sensitive tools, peer learning opportunities, case studies, and other tools that help foundations act. And this is, again, where networks and philanthropy organizations can support that transformative role and can bring those tools to the philanthropic sector, to the foundations. I also want to say that these results are considered still in the wider concern and context of the state of climate philanthropy, right? The less than 2% figure of philanthropic giving that's going to climate mitigation still holds true. We see even less than that is going to adaptation. And Indigenous people and local communities are receiving less than 1% of giving overall, despite holding some of the most crucial climate solutions and protecting some of the most important environments. And so we do need to see significant shifts in these numbers quickly. And of course, we find ourselves in a fundamentally different development landscape than we were a year ago, right? The structural contraction of the global solidarity system, and communities that are bearing the consequences of these are the same ones that are most exposed to climate impacts, to inequality, and to conflict. And so our work is becoming more difficult, but we are seeing that through collective platforms like Philanthropy for Climate, it's not impossible, right? We can still do the work, and we are seeing that the work is being done. These collective structures are really important. I'll touch lastly on your piece about governments, and then I'll close. But I think philanthropy has always been able to influence government, and this moment won't necessarily change that. I think that influence has happened because big philanthropy has had the power and the ear of decision makers, right? The institutional weight. But that has been navigated through relationships instead of navigated through structured mechanisms. And we don't see that as a model. That's a workaround, and it's a privileged workaround that's not accessible to all philanthropy. It's not accessible to the whole field. And so our approach is to advocate for structured platforms and mechanisms that can engage and create collaboration for the diversity of philanthropy. And so we're doing this at key global platforms such as the Financial Action Task Force, Financing Commons, G20, COP, the Climate COPs, the UNGA, and we've been bringing delegations to these spaces for the past couple of years to bring diverse philanthropy into these spaces, to kind of have a more representative body of what the field looks like globally to contribute to these conversations. I think as the public budgets are shrinking, the cost of capital is high, development challenges are complex, we see that there are massive calls from governments and multilaterals for philanthropy to step in, but we know we can't fill that gap entirely. And both Nicole and Delphine have mentioned what philanthropy can do. And so we need to create the opportunities and the mechanisms for that collaboration to happen in a way that's more balanced, that represents more and leverages more those other unique strengths of philanthropy. And so we're doing some of those things. We're working on those at Wings. And I think part of the piece that Nicole, you also mentioned is that capacity gap, right? There's a capacity gap on both the government side, but also the philanthropy side on how those partnerships can happen effectively. And so we're working on a partnership accelerator that's looking at these things, creating an enabling environment guide for governments, because we do need to build up that partnership muscle, right? It's not our default response, but if we can build up that muscle both within our sector and across the sectors, then we will be able, we think, to create those collaborations that can get us through this crisis moment and strengthen our sector. So I'm going to stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Erica. I mean, there's so much to touch upon, and one of the words that keeps cropping up is collaboration, and one really significant type of collaboration has been the growing movement of public-private partnerships between governments and philanthropies. And we're seeing initiatives on energy transitions, media funding, maternal health funding, for example, I know that there was a co-written report published last year between Philae and Wings, titled "Building Foundations for Collaborative Change." We can actually put that report in the chat for if anyone wants to read that. But that report alluded to this idea that foundations are most eager to increase their partnerships with the private sector and community-led organizations. So the ambition is there. But in practice, there's what all three of you are saying is that there are significant barriers to really fully embrace transformational partnerships. And Delphine, I'll just go to you first, but I'm just wondering what your view is on these different kind of financing mechanisms, and just to elaborate a little bit more about the deep structural challenges to the collaboration that we all seem to seek.
Thank you, Shafi. No, I think also echoing what you said, I think there is a desire to collaborate more. I think there is an appetite for public-private partnerships that we haven't seen before, and philanthropy really feels that it has, the potential of playing a meaningful role there. I think what we're seeing is that there is a learning curve that we need to navigate through quite quickly on both ends, from public and philanthropy, to understand what collaboration looks like, what kind of tools you bring to the table, and how those can be compatible. Oftentimes, we would find that public stakeholders now are seeing the value of philanthropy, also because public budgets are shrinking, and trying to very quickly bring philanthropy in to really support with financial resources. While on the other hand, we're seeing that philanthropy itself wants to have the possibility of also co-designing what that space looks like, of using more than only its financial assets, and being there to also support with the many other capabilities that we have around building bridges, around creating networks, around connecting with local communities, and that the value that we bring is not to step into the space that used to be owned by the public to just bring more money, but really to have that kind of different qualitative involvement that ultimately allows us to be more than the sum of our parts. So I think there is something around that is emerging. We're seeing more and more spaces where sectors come together to try to think about that and understand each other. And I think there are some promising examples of how this is emerging as a reality that we can actually really learn from, and then continue to scale in other domains. So yeah, there's a lot to be unpacked, I think, in terms of what this looks like. But it is also, to me, about really making sure that you come in with recognition of the diverse perspectives and tools that you bring, rather than trying to become more of the same, because I don't think that more of the same is necessarily what we need.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking about the conversations that have been cropping up this year at some of the major convenings. Nicole, you mentioned Skull. There's been the Global Philanthropy Forum in the US, Ottawa Civic Spaces in Canada. And at all three, the conversations that I've heard have veered to how philanthropy probably has to rethink some of its core instincts, providing services, and instead making governments or helping governments to work more effectively. And Nicole, I know you're in this area, but how that shift really requires an understanding of how power is understood, and maybe philanthropy's role in kind of assisting this idea that government budgets are also part of social justice as well as philanthropic assets.
Yeah, thank you. This is an issue that's come up a lot, and there certainly are philanthropies that have been working in this space for a long time and been big advocates of this. The Chandler Foundation, for example, has been talking about this for a long time. Gates Foundation does a lot of support to governments and to regional entities. So it's not that we haven't done this, it's that maybe we haven't, again, to go back to your point, Delphine, it's those learnings are not always shared, and the philanthropic space is so diverse that the entry point of different foundations, the kind of governance mechanisms and decision-making mechanisms within each foundation are very, very different. And so that makes that, that collaboration, but also that even the sharing of knowledge often quite difficult. So I think, one thing, I started in the philanthropic space, in the climate philanthropy space. And, I think one thing it is worth noting is that the climate philanthropy space has really leaned into this pooled fund model, I think perhaps more than some other parts of the sector. And, that is a form of collaboration where, foundations are giving up their sort of day-to-day grant making power to a large degree, to pool and work with other foundations. And, I know there have been some kind of good reports looking at the importance of that model, but I think that's one model that I think is probably growing. There's a danger that we see in the climate space as well of sort of so many overlapping pooled funds with overlapping mandates, then you then get a coordination challenge between the different pooled funds. But I think it is one of the models that's adapted to that. And I think, when you talk about something like supporting governments, that is so contextual, right? It's really, really difficult for a foundation sitting in another part of the world to effectively work with and support a government in, a part of the world where they don't have local staff and they don't understand the political and cultural context. And again, that's where some of these kind of pooled funds or intermediary mechanisms can play a really important role, because they are much more embedded in in the kind of realities and challenges and unique needs of specific parts of the world or specific sectors.
Yeah, and when we talk about systems change, that really isn't for the faint-hearted. It requires a tolerance for messiness and uncertainty, things that philanthropy doesn't necessarily hold dear. And Eric, I'm thinking of some of the essential players on this reimagining journey that we keep talking about. And I'm wondering about the role of intermediaries, particularly in the climate space. What are your thoughts on the role of intermediaries as we reimagine the landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intermediary ecosystem and infrastructure is so key, especially when now we're looking, we need to create more resilient ecosystems of philanthropy that are less dependent on external resources coming in. And that ecosystem and that infrastructure does exist, especially across the global majority, in the shape of local funds, intermediary funds. Some examples in our network are the funds that are under the Alianza Fondos del Sur, the social environmental funds of the Global South, that are spread across the world, that have this proximity to the ground, while also being able to while also having big absorption capacity for significant amounts of funding that they can redirect to where it needs to go. And so I think there are a lot of players that are leading on this kind of reimagining of what philanthropy looks like and practicing it. Another example is the GAGA, the Green Alliance for Green and Gendered Action, Global Alliance for Green and Gendered Action. And then other collaborations like the Shift the Power movement. Like, I think there's a lot of things out there that we can be learning from that can really take our narrative and our language and shift it into action and behavior change. And so I think it's a bit more of a question of, are we ready? Are we willing? Is the sector willing to really significantly make those changes? We have some of the answers are there. And so I think another piece on reimagining our sector is that it cannot happen without those who we seek to benefit having a real seat at the table. And that's where organizations and the intermediary bodies and the local funds, the indigenous-led, local community-led funds need to be spearheading. We need to listen to them. It's their voice that need to be spearheading what this reimagination looks like, because a lot of them it's already being done in practice. So I think we need to open our ears and our hearts a bit more to that and make practical steps to take from their lead, to follow their lead and make that shift.
Chef, I think you're on mute, Sheffy.
No. We seem to have lost your audio.
We can't hear you. I mean, maybe we could, while we're waiting for you to figure out we could look at some of the questions or comments that have been put in the chat while you try to sort your. So I did see there was one about, about philanthropic collaboration and this being something that's been talked about for a long time, but whether we're actually making progress on it. And maybe, I don't know if Erica or Delphine wants to comment on that.
No, thank you. I saw the comments, and I mean, first I want to say that I understand. It's not the first time that I hear that. When we were at our forum last year, we'll have our forum in a couple of weeks in Copenhagen. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm around how philanthropy is talking about collaboration, around participatory approaches, around trust-based giving, around long-term investment, around taking risks, and we, I think we're very enthusiastic about the need for this to happen. But then if you speak with people that have been in the sector for decades, you'd often find that, we've talked about this for so many years, and the movement towards implementing that and acting on what we know is really crucial also for our own legitimacy at this stake is just very slow. And so that is challenging. And I think that's something that we have to be very honest about. Yes, we are moving in a direction that I think makes sense. And that I think we collectively also see as the way forward. But I think we're also recognizing that the movement is relatively slow and that it's oftentimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And so my approach to that is to try to see where the opportunities are, to see where we are seeing some good examples and where we are seeing opportunities for foundations to learn from each other. And that goes back to that point around networks and around collective spaces for learning from each other faster, for finding courage, for finding inspiration on how you overcome some of the obstacles that you face. Because of your internal governance, because of the bylaws of your organization, because of the external context in which you operate, because of the mindset or the culture that you have in an organization. And so again, I think that networks, while they are not a full answer to a very complex problem, they are one of the solutions to try to see how we can actually live up to our own ambition as a sector. So that's... I'm afraid that's what I have for that difficult question, but I'd love to hear from you, Erica, and from you, Nicole, on how you see it.
Erica, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting piece of what you said, Delphine, is that the legitimacy of our sector, it needs to be earned. We need to work to earn it every single day, every time we make a new partnership agreement, every time we make a grant, every time we speak to a potential beneficiary. We need to earn that legitimacy. And I think we do need to continuously look at our accountability, how we're holding ourselves accountability, what our public purpose is, and being honest about what the sector is not doing. And collaboration is one of them. Trust-based, flexible, multi-year funding for local organizations. This remains the exception. It's climate funding, it remains disproportionately low. Actors with the least structural protection are chronically underinvested. And so these are some of the key things we need to continually grapple with. But I do, as I said before, think, and we see through our network, is there are organizations that are doing incredible things that we can learn from. And so creating that connective space, as Delphine mentioned, is one of the ways that networks have that kind of power to be that bridge builder, be that convener, so that we can get leaders in a room sharing with each other, learning from each other, challenging each other, and encouraging each other to go a little bit further. And this is one of the things we've been doing through our network CEO peer group that we've been piloting over the past couple of months at Wings. Because we know that networks help make our field stronger and to actually build the legitimacy of that field, we think it's really important to support those that are leading them. And so by creating a space, which is right now like a deeply personal, confidential space where we're bringing on network CEOs to feel kind of vulnerable, for them to be able to come in and hold their concerns with us, to ask to be challenged, they can find mutual support. And so again, building those spaces where that support can be found and continue to be nurtured, so that together folks can find opportunities for collaboration and shared learning. I do think that's how we can overcome some of these challenges, but we just have to show it realistically. We have to show what we're doing, why, and being transparent about that.
And if I may build on that, just Nicole, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But from research that we've done or measuring that we do with our own activities at Philea, we've had feedback that 1 on 4 of the delegates that have attended our events did something different in their day-to-day job from what they've learned at the events. And these may be small steps, but I think incremental change, even in the context of urgency that we're living in, is something that we need to continue investing in, so that we are actually changing mindsets and changing behavior one step at a time.
So are you back, Shafi? Could I make one quick comment?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you again.
Okay, please continue.
Great. I mean, a couple of responses. I mean, one, it's really interesting. This question of accountability within philanthropy came up quite strongly in some of the meetings that we held in Skoll last week, and not just from multi-stakeholder partners, but from philanthropic actors themselves. I think there was a recognition, who are we accountable to as philanthropy, and how do we how do we hold ourselves to account for the way that we interact with our grantees, with other partners. I think there's also, to me, a question here about who are we talking about within philanthropy. Like, a lot of these are really big, complex organizations, and there's a huge different range of different types of philanthropic organizations. But often there's a big difference between the kind of specialist staff practitioners, who are the ones making grants on a day-to-day basis, and the boards or the principals of foundations. And when you talk to CEOs who are sort of trying to navigate some of the space between, they're listening to what their staff say, but also having to sell this to their boards or to their principals, often some of the breakdown in the collaboration happens there, because the principals or the boards are either starting from very different places or aren't necessarily part of those collaboration conversations, and so therefore don't understand the importance of that. So I think, to the point about, are things changing? I think there's pockets of places where it's changing, but I think there's probably work to be done, maybe higher up in some of these foundations, as well as with staff level, where I think the conversations often happen. And then I think there was a question around, whether some of the intermediaries are being funded, are just foreign funding, international funding, or whether there's also local partners. And I have seen a couple, and I'm trying to think of examples of cases where there are beginning to be some initiatives that blend, local philanthropy money and international philanthropy money. But I've never seen a study of that. But I think it's something that would certainly bear scrutiny, and probably something to invest in as a sector, and thinking about how do we make sure some of the intermediaries have that more diverse and robust funding model that is blending finance, to borrow a word from the more finance sector, between local and international funders.
And maybe Nicole and Shafi, if you don't mind on that, I think one of the things we're seeing at Wings is, of course, the need to create ecosystems where we can enable that local domestic resource to be available to those local organizations, the local funds. And we are seeing this work in practice. I think there's an example from CEFIS in Chile, where they took a year and a bit to invest in doing research on what tax incentives could look like in Chile for the philanthropic sector. And through their research, they went and brought that to governments, and governments were like, okay, let's pilot this. And they piloted it, and they ended up, I need to get the exact number from my notes, but it kind of created this momentum of private funding becoming available in the sector in Chile. And that's another competitive advantage of what networks are able to do, right? That ability to kind of do the research, talk with governments, tell them what can work when you have an enabling environment for philanthropy that is supported, that is well understood, that is like in policy regulation is in there and is being supported vastly across the government. And so I think that's one of the things we can do to mitigate that risk of the external funding coming in. We need to look at what is needed to create and strengthen local philanthropic ecosystems from all sides. What can policy regulators do? What can local wealth holders do? And we're seeing a lot of high net worth individuals, the wealth accumulating across Asia and Africa. And so there is a conversation to be had with what can the regulatory body do to help make that private capital available for local development.
There's some really great point you made, Erica, on the enabling environment. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about Philea and Delphine, the kind of manifesto that you published on the single market of for philanthropy in Europe. I'm intrigued about how that's going at the moment at a regional level across Europe. What's the pace of that?
Thanks so much, Shafi. Now, so indeed, the core of the manifesto, the European Philanthropy Manifesto, is an ask to the European institutions to create a single market for public goods. So as you know, in Europe, in the EU, we have a single market, but we do not have a single market for public good, which means that there are a lot of barriers and challenges if you want to move an organization or a philanthropic organization to another country, if you want to donate across border, if you want to merge organizations, and that has very important implications in terms of the cost for doing the work. It has very big implications in terms of collaboration itself as well, because it is quite challenging to do that in this context. And so we've been advocating for the European institutions to really facilitate cross-border philanthropy, but also to enable and empower philanthropy, to partner with philanthropy, and to dialogue with philanthropy. So those are some of the core asks of that manifesto. I think the good news is that there is an increasing recognition by the European institutions of the value of philanthropy, and that translates, among others, in new opportunities for public-private philanthropy partnerships, where the European institution is really also inviting philanthropy to have conversations around how they can do things together and think about opportunities for collaborative funding. And we're also working with Wings on a project in this context, trying to find spaces and opportunities for philanthropic organizations to do that. I think there are also a number of other files on the table at European level that are interesting and that we're monitoring quite attentively. One around the creation of a European cross-border association statute, which would not be specifically for foundations, but for associations, and would allow that kind of European level association statute to become a reality, which would allow for more of that European level work. It is still in conversation. You know that taking decisions at EU level is quite a complex endeavor, but we're very much hoping that that would become a reality. On the other hand, there are potentially opportunities around what is called the 28 regime, which goes beyond what is doable at the level of 27 member states. And there too, we're considering whether there would be opportunities also for philanthropy to have that possibility of doing good fully in an integrated, let's say, European single market. And then maybe to end also on that point, Philea has also integrated last year what was previously known as Transnational Giving Europe. Transnational Giving Europe is a long-standing partnership that existed between foundations and philanthropic organizations from 19 countries, and basically is a mechanism that allows for tax-effective donations between those 19 countries, so that if you want to donate in another country, compared to the tax advantage that you would have at home, you're not being sanctioned because the cause you care about is just not in the country that you are living in. So we've recently taken that on board within Philea. We're very proud to be hosting it. We have rebranded it to Giving Europe. It feels a little bit more contemporary and is now also in a phase of really further developing that as a mechanism that we will continue to sustain for as long as that single market is not a reality in policy and structure. So.
And with Philea's work, I also know that there's been a lot of work on restrictive foreign agents laws that are happening across Europe, and someone in the chat has just mentioned the rise of foreign agents laws in East Africa that will harm African philanthropists as well as in India. We know what's going on in the US in a very different context. And I'm just kind of thinking, as we kind of get to the end of our session here, about the need to enlarge our legal toolbox with the regulatory constraints. And I'm wondering the need for that in terms of engaging with, for example, impact investing. We've talked about the reimagining of the landscape. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts, any of you here, on this importance to enlarge our legal toolbox?
I'm happy to quickly respond to that, maybe to kind of jump on the foreign agent laws. I think this is something that we're definitely concerned about also in Europe. And not only foreign agent laws, but different ways in which we see the space of philanthropy being challenged. As mentioned, we've always had a very favorable environment in Europe, so we've been incredibly lucky to operate in a context that was supportive of philanthropy. But there are more and more challenges and barriers that are being put up in countries where you see regimes that are less just interested in seeing philanthropy thrive, and with that, oftentimes also seeing civil society thrive. So that is something that we're very concerned with. We do see the value of having a kind of a collaborative space approach towards different forms of capital that can actually contribute to some of those causes that our membership really care about, around climate, around equality, around democracy, and so many other sub themes and related themes. We're seeing also that there is a bit of an overlap of, oftentimes between foundations themselves wishing to use not only their assets, but also their program funds to do more than just grant making and potentially look into the impact investing space. And we're aware of the fact that in some countries there are restrictions around the possibilities to do that. So definitely making sure that we address that and that we understand, where the obstacles are, how we can mitigate them is something that on our end at European level, we're very interested in pursuing.
Thank you so much, Delphine. Last few minutes, I'm going to turn to both Erica and Nicole. I would really love to end on some message of hope, which actually this webinar has largely been. We've kind of gone beyond the crises and we've talked about reimagining. I just want to have your final thoughts on, just as we reimagine the landscape, what should our audience take away and can bring in within their own context? Nicole, I'll go with you.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing I would just say is that we're in a messy phase right now. Like, the world is messy, philanthropy is messy, development is messy. And I think to some degree we have to have a little bit of comfort with that messiness and realize this isn't a period where we have clear trajectories, we have answers, we know where we're going. It is a period of experimentation and trial and error and, trying new things, building relationships with new partners. And not all of those will pan out, but only by taking some calculated bets and recognizing that not all of them will pan out are we going to kind of find the things that will help us build a different development system or international system or democracy system, whatever it is you're working on. And so I think that kind of risk appetite piece, and this is where philanthropy is really uniquely positioned, compared to other parts of the ecosystem. It does have the ability to take those risks and to experiment and to support others to experiment. And so I think one of the things that's come out quite strongly from a lot of the conversations is a kind of a humility about the fact that we don't know the answers right now, and we're all learning and we all are trying to learn from each other, and we all have different roles in that. I mean, there was a really interesting discussion too among a couple of philanthropies about one working very closely with the US government at the moment, another saying, oh, well, we could never do that, but saying, oh, look, I'm glad you're doing that. We each have different roles in this philanthropic ecosystem, and that's good, and that's a strength. So, I think this period of fermentation is exciting because there is huge opportunity, and I think we have to grasp that and also really commit to support our partners, but particularly one of the things that we've seen in the kind of development space is that a lot of the money that's going for reimagining is going to the same kind of institutions in the global north. And so one of the things we've been trying to sort of talk about as a group is how do we make sure that as we do that reimagining, that the voices who have a stay in that reimagining are more diverse, more globally representative, representing different youth and government, the different constituencies and stakeholders, even within the global south or within different regions. So I think that's one thing for us to think about: what is our role as philanthropy in making sure a diverse group of people get to shape that future.
Yeah, Erica, I can see you're nodding along pretty much word for what Nicole said.
Yes, I am. And I think maybe I'll just say that it really needs the communities that philanthropy exists to serve and to benefit need to be at the front of the reimagination and the transformation of our sector. We need to listen to them of what they need us to become and to be. And so I agree with everything that Nicole's saying. Lastly, before we disconnect, I want to shamelessly plug the Wings Forum. That is our tri-annual conference that only comes around every 3 years. And these are the exact kind of conversations we're going to be talking about. The theme is ACT, but not in a rhetorical way. Really, what are the examples? What are the things that exist? What can we leverage and learn from so that we can take one step forward, so that we can risk to fail, but to learn from that failure? And so how are we really acting in a very practical way? And we're going to be grappling with all of the questions that came up in this webinar. So I do hope that you join us. And the early bird ticket registration ends tomorrow. And I'll drop the link in the chat. Thank you.
Amazing. This conversation has been so uplifting. Often, sometimes they're not. When it comes to crisis, this has been uplifting. Thank you so much to all three of you. It's been a pleasure. And to our audience, thank you so much. Please keep the conversation going on social media, and thank you to our partners, Anglo American, for today. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you soon for another webinar session. Bye for now.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.